Hello everyone and welcome to this particular talk in the IDEA in TEGSEM series. So my name is Mikee Vega and I came from De La Salle University. I graduated back in 2018 and I debated for La Salle for about 5 years, and I coached St. Scholastica's College back in 2013 to 2017, I think. And from 2017 to 2019, I coached the De La Salle University Senior High School team, and I was also its founding coach. And before that, I was actually a high school debater. I was the Undersecretary General of the IDEA community back in 2011 to 2012. Probably you guys were still babies. And at the time, I was debating for St. Scholastica's College. So today, due to the invitation of your, I think, your secretariat, I will be talking to you guys about a topic that I kind of love debating about. It's a very dynamic topic. And at the same time, it's very, very conceptual. And it really requires you to know certain frameworks for you to debate it properly. And today, that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about. I'm going to talk to you about navigating politics, okay? So let's begin, okay? So today, I'm going to talk to you about 4 things. The first one being the big principle. As I said, while politics as a theme is a very dynamic topic with numerous changes every day in the world, it is still nonetheless a very conceptual topic, and therefore the first thing I want to talk to you guys about is this big principle upon which I'd say, this is arguable of course, but upon which I'd say that a lot of the concepts in politics spring from. The second thing I'll talk to you guys about is the concept, like political thoughts, the concepts behind the general political frameworks that exist, which I think is very important in terms of analyzing how people view governance and how people view policy making, which is a crucial part of governance, a crucial part of politics. And then third, we'll talk about the basics of government. Here, I'll talk to you guys about some government systems that exist and essentially what they're about, what are their basic assumptions about human beings, as well as some controversies about them. The fourth one that I'll talk to you guys about is probably the most prevalent government system in the world. Basically, it's the type of government system that a lot of countries ascribe to, even the Philippines, and that's basically a democracy. So without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so the first thing, as I said, that we'll talk about is the big principle. Okay, so in this slide, you'll see that I put together a few pictures of the beginning of humanity, depending on which belief system you ascribe to. For some people, and this is including me, there are people who do believe in the creation story, the fact that God created the world and that human beings are a product of that creation. And then there are also people who have a different belief system and instead believe that human beings are part of this long process of evolution, which led to human beings as we know them today. But I think regardless of the belief system, what I really want to emphasize here in this particular slide is the fact that in the beginning, the humanity wasn't really the way it is right now. Definitely not with the technology, but even in terms of the lifestyle, right? Leadership, the concept of groups, the concept of leaders, the concept of rules, which are all concepts that are related to politics, was not present in the very, very beginning, right? Because in the beginning, essentially, whatever standard of behavior you wanted, whether you wanted to be naked, whether you wanted to farm in a certain land, whether you wanted to move around and be nomadic, that's completely up to the human beings to decide upon, right? But eventually, now we find ourselves in a different scenario, right? We have groups, and in our groups, there are leaders. And I guess in a bigger scale, since the beginning of history, we've had numerous civilizations. And in today's world, while this could be considered another civilization, right? This is the society we know today. The fact that there is governance and the fact that there is politics behind everything. The picture I put in here actually is the first civilization that is known to mankind, which is the civilization in Sumer. And this is the Sumerian king. So even in the first civilization, you already have a concept of governance through the monarchy, through the king that exists, right? So how did people get here? And this is where this big principle starts to be more elaborated upon, or should I say this is where that principle is further manifested. So Thomas Hobbes said that a man be willing when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary to lay down his right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. So this is quite a chunk of words, right? I think what I want you guys to focus on is the concept that a man is willing, but here's the caveat, when others are so too. So a man will only be willing when others are so too, for what? For peace and defense, to lay down this right to all things. So as I mentioned a while ago, man is naturally free in the beginning, right? We can do what we want. But as far as governance is concerned, a man becomes willing for peace and defense along with other people to lay down this right to all things and to be contented with whatever liberty is left behind from what he chooses to forgo. And that is essentially the big principle that I wanted to talk to you guys about. And that is the social contract theory. So yes, it's a theory. And under this, there are 3 tenets that you have to remember, right? So as I said a while ago, and I think I'm being quite repetitive in this, the first one is that man is born free, right? This concept that human beings essentially, if there isn't any rule out there, or if there isn't any government, man would basically be free to do whatever they want, in the same way that animals do whatever they want, in whatever circumstance, right? But, and here's the second tenet, there is a general collective will to achieve a common good. So even if man is born free, the fact that there are multiple human beings means that there is to some extent a struggle. And therefore, for peace and defense, there is a general collective will. The collective will being wanting to achieve a common good, right? And then, because people want to then achieve that common good, what do? That's the third tenet. They renounce their freedom, right? And then the rights that they previously had as a free human being, like to do anything they want. If they want to murder somebody, if they want to, go out, be naked, all of these freedoms, right? What they do is they transfer that right to what is called a sovereign. So a sovereign can be many things. Could be a person, could be a body of people, could be a group of people, could be a new person in the form of a government. Either way, the sovereign gets the right to choose of the people who forgo their freedom for the collective will, right? So that is essentially the social contract theory. Now, for sure, there are a lot of questions here, right? Among these questions would be, what is good, right? Because we can say there's a collective good, but what really is good for people? Second is, how do people choose a sovereign? Do we choose a person like the Sumerian kings? Do we go for groups of people? Do we, get led by companies? Who really can be a sovereign, and how do we choose them, right? What freedoms can we renounce? Do we really renounce all freedoms? Do we lose all our freedoms for the collective good? Right? What else are the questions? Is a sovereign forever? Right? Should we have the right to change our sovereign? Or should sovereigns exist for the entirety of their lifetime? And this is an interesting question as well. Is there really a collective will? Do we really have common interests? Or should the world be more of a free-for-all, man against man, dog eats dog kind of world? What rights can we renunciate? Should we just give up everything to the sovereign? Another interesting question actually is, what freedoms are we really born with? Or what freedoms are just manufactured for us? And what are the rights that the sovereign should have? So, the social contract theory, while it clarifies some things, like any framework, it still leaves a lot of room for questions. And here's the thing, that's why you're debating. All of these questions are basically the things that we're trying to balance and discuss whenever we have a debate topic, whenever we're discussing a certain policy. For example, if you're going to talk about banning abortion, then definitely, to some extent, you'll be talking about to what extent a government or a sovereign can take rights from people. The same way, you also discuss what freedoms citizens are entitled to still have with themselves, right? And even the basic question of what really is good or what really is the collective will is also a question that you're going to answer in that particular topic. So as you'll see, debate becomes dynamic that way because even within this framework, right, there are many different answers to the different questions and you can answer them in different ways. And that's what makes a good debate, basically. So yeah, that's the big principle here, the big principle of the social contract theory. Now let's go to the second one, political thoughts. So for sure, you've heard people say, I really don't like that. That's too political for my liking. Why do you always talk about politics? Or if you're already talking to political-minded people, then probably you might be getting into a disagreement about your concept of what is right or wrong for society. And I think if you haven't encountered this particular topic, then this is a good starting point for you to understand different points of views out there. Okay. So this is essentially the political compass. Now, the political compass is a way for us to understand the political leanings of a person, a group, or a society. And the fundamental assumption of the political compass, I know there are like latter versions of this one that go beyond these two axes, but I think as a starting point, these two are already good enough for you just to get a good grasp of what people think, or how people think rather, right? They divide them into two axes. The first one is the economic scale, and the second one is the social scale. So the economic scale is sorry if I'll go a bit algebraic here, it's in the x-axis, the economic scale, and on the y-axis, you have the social scale. So what is the economic axis, right? So for the economic axis, what it essentially talks about is how the person views the economy. What is the right way for us to manage the economy? So if you have taken up like the basics of microeconomics, what you would know is that there are essentially two views to it. The first one on the right is what they call laissez-faire, which is essentially free competition, that the market or the economy should work on its own. Meaning, for example, governments shouldn't have laws about pricing, shouldn't have laws about how companies should establish themselves, should not have like competition laws, etc., etc. So the fundamental belief of the economic right is that the market on its own will work best. And if you take your basic microeconomics, this is essentially because of the law of supply and demand. So as long as the producers, like the sellers, the companies, they can't really price all of their goods as high as they could, because on the converse, you have consumers who will always buy at the lowest amount possible. So because of that particular incentive scheme, right, they will almost always meet in the middle. And because of that, the market in itself will correct its own errors. So if you want to know more about it, definitely you should read more about this particular view of the economy, right? So the idea as well is that as long as there's competition, like capitalism, laborers competing against other laborers, if they're competing against other laborers, then essentially what they'll do is they'll try to upskill themselves. And because they're upskilling themselves, all in all, the economy's labor force becomes better. In the same way, producers will try to compete with other producers by producing in the most efficient way possible. And therefore, all in all, the economy will be as efficient as it could be. So, because of this fundamental assumption, the idea of the economic right is that the government should not really try to meddle with the economy, which means it should not raise taxes. It should lower taxes instead. It should. There are many different policies that they can have, but the fundamental premise of it all being that the economy should function on its own with little to no intervention. On the other side of the scale, you have the left, which basically thinks otherwise. So if you have competition on the other, the left, on the other hand, wants a cooperative or a collective agency. So here, they don't really want to compete. The fundamental assumption being that if people compete naturally, there will be like different classes, and naturally, some producers will get a bigger piece of the pie than others. And therefore, there is a need for us to redistribute and make sure that everybody has absolutely equal access to all resources, or equal resources depending on your view of the left. But either way, the point is that you just don't want competition, and at the bare minimum, you want there to be a government, like some forms of government intervention to make sure that wealth is distributed evenly, as opposed to the right, which prefers a world where there is no distribution and just people just compete for wealth, right? So based on those two scales, you're already seeing different ways of viewing the world. And I think a good exercise would be to talk to different people, like talk to your mom. What do they think of the economy? Should the government be subsidizing certain industries? If a bank goes bankrupt, should the government try to save them by lending them money? Should governments lessen taxes? These are concepts, or these are everyday opinions that people have that they don't really know are already within the bounds of politics. And it's a good exercise to read up on both views so that in a debate, you are equipped to defend either way, right? The second scale, one of the Y, the up-down. So if you're confused, the x-axis is the left-right, and then the y-axis is up-down. So for the y-axis, you have the social scale. So the social scale is all about the level of freedom that you want to afford to people. So here you have two views. The one in the bottom would be libertarian, which seeks to maximize personal freedoms and minimize government control. So if you remember the social contract theory, right? For libertarians, the idea is that we shouldn't really be giving up so much of our rights. We shouldn't be giving up a lot of the freedoms that we innately have to the government. And instead, we should maximize our personal freedoms. On the other hand, right, on the other end of the scale, the idea is that you should renunciate a lot of your rights, and that the government should be the central authority, and that individuals should obey that authority in order for there to be peace and order. And those are the two scales, up and down, right? Now, if you combine both of them, what happens essentially is you already have a mix of different views. You already have essentially a political standing. So for example, if a person doesn't like government at all, like doesn't want the government to intervene in their lives and doesn't want the government to intervene in the economy, then chances are you have someone who is part of the libertarian right. And these are generally people who don't trust government authorities or don't trust authority in general, right? On the other hand, you may have people who are okay with, trying to limit the ability of people to act on like their personal freedom to maintain peace and order, but at the same time still wants to maintain a capitalist world, then you probably have someone who is leaning towards the authoritarian right. There are people who are okay with maximizing social freedoms, but are not really okay with governments trying to have a lot of control over how people act. And in that case, you have someone who is already part of the libertarian left. And then there are the people who wants the government to just try to control everything, try to maximize government control of behaviors, as well as maximizing government control of the economy. And in that case, you have someone who's in line with the authoritarian left. So of course, because this is a scale after all, there are different degrees. It doesn't have to be completely extreme. You can be somewhere in the middle. Completely apathetic people would be like at the center of this cross, have literally no leaning. But that's exactly the beauty of a scale. We can fall anywhere in it. And it's a good exercise to think about the people you know and try to map out where they are on the scale. So that's it. I think this is a very, very useful tool. In my experience, it's a very useful tool in terms of understanding and characterizing different groups of people in different political parties, different political groups, different individuals, as well as to figure out what their tendency is, what are their likely actions, what are their likely opinions regarding certain controversies. So this one's a very, very useful tool to have. Okay. Wow, we're speeding through this one. The third one that I want to talk to you guys about is basically the basics of government. That's double basically, but yeah, the basics of government. So here we'll talk about some government systems that you'll hear a lot in debate. I won't be surprised if you've heard some of these things discussed in class, probably in your history classes or even in your social studies classes. Okay, so let's begin. So for government styles, I'll talk about just 6. So there are a lot. And there's a big debate about what should be considered a government style or if it's supposed to be an economic style. So here I'm broadly using the term government in the sense that I am using it in terms of policy making. Like, given certain systems, how are they, what are their fundamental assumptions about human beings and what are their usual courses of action when it comes to different issues. And the reason why I chose this set of 6 as well is because they are the ones that you will hear a lot in debates. And what I want you guys to note here is where they stand in the political compass. So I won't throw the bone. I won't give you guys the answer, but it's probably a good exercise for you to think about where they are in the scale. Okay, so let's begin. The first one is anarchy. So anarchy is characterized by the absence of a government or any ruling body. And here's a bit of characterization of an anarchic state, right? They don't have public utilities or services. They don't have regulatory control. They have limited diplomatic relations with other nation states. And in most instances, it's a society divided into different locally ruled settlements. And usually, you'll find that post-conflict states are in an anarchic state. So the example here is the post-Civil War Somalia in 1991, right? So I put here a meme which says it's called anarchy, it means freedom. Because to some extent, it is true that it means freedom, particularly because there is no government in the case of an anarchy. Or if ever there is a government the government isn't really effective, and therefore virtually there is no system that rules, or there is no system that exercises authority within that particular country, right? So think about it. Where is anarchy rather in the political compass? The second thing, and this is becoming quite the topic nowadays, is communism, right? So I put here a meme that says no to meme, but says to us, particularly because that is like an interesting illustration of how communists see the world. So in its purest form, and the reason why I put the caveat in purest form here, because obviously communism has been applied differently in different countries and in different places as well. And therefore, our view of communism could be kind of affected by its execution in different countries all over the world. But in its purest form, it just means that there is common public ownership rather, of the economy, including infrastructure, utilities, and the means of production, right? And here are some characterizations of a communist society in its purest form. It's a place, or it's a system where there is no class division. It also inherently requires the subversion of the ruling class by the working class. And therefore, in a lot of cases, if you read up on societies that have transitioned into communism, they often incorporate the idea of revolutionary action against unequal rule. So, for example, in the case of the Soviet communist government, which is the example I put here, right? The events during when they overthrew the Tsar of Russia was basically the precedent to the establishment of the Soviet communist government, right? And this was led by the working class of Russia. So while the purest form is all about the public ownership, a crucial part of communism is the concept of taking down the ruling class. And because of that, that's where the controversy often lies, right? So again, like the first one, like anarchy, think about it. Where would communism fall within the political compass? Okay, the third one is a hot topic in the Philippines, but it has recently died down, what with COVID. The third one is federalism. So federalism isn't so much about the view of the world. Well, to some extent, it is still part of the view of the world, but it isn't so much about that as it is about the concept of government control. So for federalism, it's actually a form of government that combines and divides authority and power between a centralized federal authority and an array of regional and local authorities. So a good example of this would be the United States of America. So if I'm going to further dissect this, the idea is that you have local governments that are very empowered, and at the same time, you have a central government that plans for the entirety of the state. So in the case of the United States of America, for sure you have the federal government, which is comprised of the president, the Senate, the vice president, but at the same time, they're very, very particular about their state governments, which are essentially led by the governors. And if you're gonna compare the level of control that state governors in the US have vis-a-vis the president and the federal government versus comparing the powers of, let's say, a provincial governor in the Philippines vis-a-vis the president of the Philippines, definitely there's a difference in terms of the authority. Admittedly, and this is kind of my difficulty discussing federalism, it's a very thin line, like how different it is. And to some extent, it's very legalistic, the differences that exist between the federal government and the local government. And that's exactly why I put this meme here. When the federal government tells you one thing, but state government says something different. Because this is essentially one of the biggest pain points of federalism. That the federal government can often get into a contradiction or conflict with what the with what the state government wants, right? But there is a thought process behind why federal governments still choose to be federal as opposed to a centralized government. So yeah. Next, socialism. So this one is I'd say you have to read up a lot on socialism, because I think there are a lot of debates. More than communism, I think we have a lot more debates that are geared towards comparing a socialist point of view versus, I'd say, like a capitalist point of view. So what is socialism? So socialism is a form of government in which the people own the primary means of production compared to the competitive nature of capitalism. So here, it's similar with communism in that there is public ownership, but I think that this is the crucial difference, right? Because socialism is typified currently by policies that combine free market capitalism with extensive public works, including free healthcare, free education, a comprehensive welfare state, and high percentages of unionized workers. So if you notice here, there isn't necessarily an overthrowing of the ruling class. Instead, what socialism does is they integrate, the concept of public ownership into free market capitalism. And that's why essentially what you have are a lot of welfare programs like public works, free healthcare, free education, and a good example of this would be the Nordic society. So I think it's very, very important to read up on this. And the reason why I think inevitably I kind of brushed on communism and started talking about it is because of this meme, right? You have people saying that socialism never works, and then, people who are well read on the topic would usually use the Nordic societies as an example of socialism doing well, right? And then people would say, but that's not socialism. That's just a capitalist country with strong welfare policies. And then essentially people are like, we still shouldn't do that because that's socialist. So I think, and this is my personal opinion, I just want to put the caveat out there, that because there are, similarities between socialism and communism insofar as their worldview is concerned, people often mistake the two for one another, and therefore, this fear of communism often trickles down into a fear of socialism. And I think it's very crucial to read up on the differences of the two for your personal education, but also just so in debates you don't mix up the two. Okay? Next, we have a very, very controversial form of government, the dictatorship. So dictatorship, I think you probably know a lot about this already. It's an authoritarian form of government in which the ruling party recognizes no limitations whatsoever on its power, either in the public life or private rights of its citizens. So this is essentially, in purest form, a dictatorship would essentially just believe that the sovereign has each and every right over its people, right? So how does this happen? What are its what are the characteristics of a state within a totalitarian government, right? They often employ widespread surveillance. They control the mass media. They intimidate demonstrations of paramilitary or police power. They have intimidating demonstrations of paramilitary or police power, and they suppress protest, activism, or political opposition. Okay, and in most cases, they tend to be led through fascism, which is basically totalitarianism that is supported by a philosophy that exalts nation and race above the person. So, for example, in Nazi Germany, right, the philosophy is that people, Jews should die in order for the German nation to rise to its full potential with the Aryan race. That's fascism, essentially. And that's something we don't just not embrace it. We don't like that, right? An example of this would be North Korea. There are arguments to say that we're slowly transitioning back to a dictatorial government. we were under a dictatorship under Ferdinand Marcos when he established martial law. I don't think that's a debate. Yeah, that's a dictatorship. Your thoughts on whether we are in a dictatorship? Lastly, and this is, let me just go back to the slide a while ago. So, the meme I put here is, I believe in benevolent dictatorship, provided I am the dictator. Because, I don't know if you find it as humorous as I do, but I find it funny because I think a fundamental belief of dictatorship is that there are people who are so benevolent, they're like a father figure to the nation, that they will sacrifice a lot for the nation, and therefore they have the right to be a dictator. I find that funny, but it's up for discussion, guys. I think it's a good starting point for a discussion. Okay, next we have a democracy. Democracy. So, the democracy is basically defined as a form of government in which the people are given a direct role in choosing their leadership. So, how do we choose our leaders? Elections, right? And that's why democracies are typified by fair and free elections. So, that's a crucial characteristic. It has to be free and fair. Civic participation, so people actively participate in governance. The protection of human rights and the rule of law, right? And the example is, over half of the world's nations actually identify themselves as democracies. Like the Philippines, we identify ourselves as a democracy because we still have elections. We have a government that is supposedly accountable to the people. So, I guess that's a democracy. So those are the 6 types of governments out there. There are definitely others still, like monarchies, oligarchies. These are terms that you will hear, not necessarily about government systems, but just societies in general. So I do implore you guys to read up on them as well. But I think for the purpose of our discussion, these are the things that are most crucial for you to understand. Okay. So now that I've introduced to you the government systems, let's zoom in to the most, I wouldn't say controversial, but, the most talked about government system, probably most likely because of its prevalence, democracies, okay? So here's the thing. If you notice, out of everything, democracies are probably arguably, they're probably the least practical, but most principled. So if you notice, dictatorships are just straightforward. We just need to get the job done, need a leader, and therefore, dictatorships are just like, we need to get the job done, and therefore, we need to have a leader, essentially. But in the case of a democracy, that's not the case. Instead, you have principles. So in the case of democracies, there are 3 principles that you have to remember. And these are often, the points of discussion in a debate. Number 1 is participation. Number 2 is accountability. And number 3 is representation. So I'll go through them. And I think a crucial question that you might want to ask is whether these principles are fluff. Meaning, they're just things that we talk about. They're things we aspire for. But, when push comes to shove, they're not really things that we consider at the end of the day. And then secondly, you have the question of whether they're priorities. So they're either fluff or priorities. So you take your pick in that. Okay, so let's go to the first one, participation. So the fundamental concept of participation is that democracies essentially are typified by the rule of the people, right? And because the people should own their government, consequently, people have the right and duty to participate in government processes. And that's why in a democracy, you have an election, because that's how people choose their government. And at the same time, and this is often forgotten, right? People also have the ability to lead because that's part of their participation in the democracy. So compared to, other other government systems, like let's say the monarchy or dictatorship. You know, leadership isn't something that's accessible to people because it's invested in a sovereign. But in a democracy, right, because the accountability is supposedly for the people, right, then consequently they must participate as well, and they should be given the right to participate as well. And I think I foreshadowed it, right? The second principle is accountability. Because the people own their government, it means that leaders are accountable to their voters. So whatever they promise their voters, you know, they should, you know, follow through with that. And likewise, conversely, right, voters, and this I think is an often under-discussed part of democracy, voters are also accountable for choosing right leaders. So essentially, that ecosystem is supposed to create a good government, because in theory, if I am a voter, I will be voting for my interests, and because I'm voting for my interests, I would likely vote for a good leader, right? Likewise, a good leader would want to still continue to stay in power, and because he or she wants to continue to stay in power, he or she will do good in government. And supposedly that accountability system should create an overall good type of governance, right? So accountability is supposed to make that happen. The third one is specific to representative democracy, which is essentially, I think, the democracy that we know as of today. Because before, right, if you remember your history classes, democracy actually started as a direct democracy, like literally in Athens, you know, people, males specifically, the male citizens would, you know, join together as a group and vote on issues, on policy, etc. But today, because of population and logistical issues, we have a representative democracy. And that's why representation then became a principle in democracy, right? And the idea here is that because people choose their leaders, the leaders should always represent the interests of their voters. And because they are just representatives, they should make their decisions based on the interests of their constituents. And that's the reason I think I put AOC and Donald Trump here, because essentially, you know, you can disagree with me, but I think they do represent the people who voted for them. Like, you've seen how AOC is in Congress, right? And the way that she tackles issues, the way that she tries to, you know, create legislation or question existing legislation is very much in line with the interests of the people who voted her into power, right? Mostly the working class, and mostly people who do believe in socialist policies. And likewise, that's the way she represents them. And I think it's the same for Donald Trump, because, well, in some shape or form, I mean, the people who voted for him don't want immigration, are not particularly okay with immigrants, and likewise, that's his style of ruling. You know, what was his first point of policy, right? Deportation of illegal immigrants. You know, those are his priorities, largely because those are the priorities of their constituents. Now, obviously, there are other issues as well about whether in the other concerns like creating jobs, whether or not he really does that. But I think that's where the debate lies, right? To what extent should leaders really just follow through on what they said in an election 4 years ago or 2 years ago? To what extent should we trust our representatives to make decisions for us that wouldn't necessarily be, you know, decisions that we would have made ourselves? Like in times of war, if I don't want to go to war, why is it that the government can decide to go to war on behalf of this, on behalf of the entire state? So those are questions that are often those are questions that are often asked within the realm of the principles of democracy. To what extent do we expect citizens to participate? To what extent do we hold our government officials accountable? To what extent or how should government officials represent us? So those are fundamental questions that are within the discussion of them principles, and that's why I think at the heart of it all, there is a question of whether or not these principles are just fluff or whether they're actual priorities within democracies around the world. So yeah, the second I want to discuss about governments, well, democratic governments particularly, are the branches, because I think this one kind of explains or demonstrates how the principles theoretically, or like how the principles, even if they're in theory, how they are applied into the day-to-day operations of a democratic government. So the branches exist to ensure that there are checks and balances among all the authority figures. And to make the discussion easier, what I did was I used the standard of the law. So what is their function in relation to the rule of law? Because as I said, a democratic government is typified by the rule of law. So just the precursor, right? The constitution of the democracy, or the main principles of the democracy, the Magna Carta, or whatever central document there is, that is essentially where the rule of law comes from. And the rule of law is essentially translated into actual policy, or jurisprudence through the different branches, and they are the legislative government, a legislative branch. I have a professor who corrected me before and said it's legislative, so legislative, executive, and you also have the judicial branch. Okay. So, them branches. And here's a question I want you guys to ask when you're taking a look at governments around the world. Do the branches really balance each other out, or are they colluding? Colluding meaning, are they teaming up to consolidate power within government? Okay, let's go to the first one, the executive branch. So the executive branch is tasked with executing and implementing the law. So how do they implement the law? They create specific policies that promote the principles and agreements within the Constitution, and then, the laws that are made by the legislative branch. And then the executive branch essentially makes all of these policies. The executive branch is actually led by the head of government and is supported by the implementation agencies like the cabinet and the police force. So, there are different executive branches all over the world. There are governments that are led by the prime minister. So in the case, for example, of Canada, which is in the picture here, you have Justin Trudeau as the prime minister, the head of government, and then you have his cabinet members who are essentially tasked with executing whatever policies that they are able to pass within parliament. And then you have, like in the Philippines, a presidential type of government where you have the president, a vice president, and then there is the cabinet that essentially creates the national policy. And then I think, at least in the Philippines, it extends to the provincial governments where you have the governors, the vice governors, down to the barangay captains. All of these people, the mayors, they are essentially executing the law. They're implementing the Constitution. They're implementing the laws coming from the legislative branch, and they're translating them to actual policy within their own jurisdictions or within their own areas. And in terms of the balance of powers, the executive branch is actually the one that checks the judiciary branch. How do they do that? They do that they do that through the power of appointment. So, for example, in the Philippines, it's actually the president who appoints the Supreme Court justice, or like the justices of the Supreme Court, the chief justice of the Supreme Court, and the other justices of the Supreme Court. Of course, there are rules about it. The integrated bar still has a say in it, but essentially, at the end of the day, it's actually the president who appoints a justice whenever a justice has to retire. Okay. Second would be the legislative branch. They are tasked with the creation of the law, which means that they pass policies. And here's a crucial clincher. They also pass major government decisions like, entering a war, major government treaties, interstate treaties. For example, in the Philippines, the Visiting Forces Agreement, it's actually debatable whether that's something that should be ratified actually, I'm not a law student, but I think law students out there, if you're a coach and you're watching this, comment down below and correct me. But from what I remember, at least from my course, legal management, major treaties have to be ratified by the Senate, by the legislative branch, and that's why I think we had an issue in the pulling out from the Rome Statute, I think. Yeah, law students, please correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, and they do that through representatives. So, for example, here you'll see the example of the Parliament of the United Kingdom. So in here, they really discuss, they really discuss the laws that they want to pass and the policies as well. I just put here an emphasis on major government decisions because I think that's often forgotten. People have a misconception that it's the president who decides whether we go to war or not, but actually it's the legislative branch. Second, this is a very legal term. They hold the power of the purse, which means that they're ultimate decision makers for the state budget. So this is actually an issue right now in the Philippines, right? The issue of the state budget. And that's because the budget is technically a law that we pass. And that's why it has to be ratified by the members of the legislative branch. As I said, legislative branches all over the world take different forms. On the national level, it could be the parliament, could be a senate, could be a congress. And on a local level, it could be your local councils, your barangay councils, for example. Those are actually legislative branches as well, as long as they are groups of body comprised of representatives that create policies. Then definitely that's a legislative branch. Now, when it comes to the checks and balances, it's actually the legislative branch that checks the executive branch, and they have the power of impeachment in order to enact their balancing power. Now, here's a distinction I want to make now that we're at the topic of the legislative branch. So, you've probably heard about political parties. So, political parties are essentially organized groups of people that have roughly similar political aims and opinions, and they seek to influence public policy by getting their candidates elected to public office. So, in this case, in the US, for example, you have Republicans and Democrats. I put in the meme here because, in a bipartisan system, more often than not, there is a back and forth. In this case, you see that type of back and forth. Interestingly, for political parties, again, the political framework of the political compass still plays a role because most political parties ascribe to a specific sphere of the specific part of the political compass. So, for example, the U.S. Republicans, you can consider them as a conservative right, mostly because they advocate for fiscal and social conservatism. So, if you notice the policies that they're currently lobbying for, they want little government spending, they don't want universal health care, and at the same time, they espouse like Christian values when they try to limit Planned Parenthood, all these types of policies that they have. And then going back to the branches, the last branch that I want to talk about is the judiciary. So this is a highly technical branch, mostly because you have the lawyers here. But essentially what you just have to understand about the judiciary branch as far as politics is concerned is that they are tasked with interpreting the law, and they decide on cases and disputes that are brought to them by individuals and government agencies. And they're actually led by the country's Supreme Court, and they are supported by the judicial agencies that exist. So by interpreting the law, essentially if there is a case that is filed, or if someone questions a law, whether it's constitutional or not, it's actually the judiciary branch that makes the call on that. And they're actually the check and balance for the legislative branch, just to make sure that the legislative branch uses their power according to the limits of the Constitution. So that's the judiciary branch. So I'm almost out of time. So those are the things that we discussed today. We discussed the social contract theory as the big principle behind politics. Second, we discussed the political compass as a way for you to organize political thoughts. Third, we went through the basic government systems that you'll usually come across in debates. And lastly, we did a crash course on the basics of democracies. Notice though that while my topic was navigating politics, I haven't really talked about what politics means. And I made it a point to make it the last part of my lecture. So if you notice, all throughout the things that we discussed, at the end of it all, it's really a question of how do people view power and how do people use power. Because that is essentially what politics is all about. Politics is all about using power and achieving and using power in a country or society. And that's exactly how the HarperCollins publishers define politics rather in their English dictionary. And I think it's a worthy definition to have, because at the end of it all, politics is all about the question of who's got the power. So basically that's it. Thank you everyone for listening to my lecture, and I really hope you guys learned a lot. I know that the IDEA Secretariat is going to be posting this video, but just in case you have any questions, just feel free to leave them here as a comment down below. I'll be happy to try to drop by in this group and answer them if you have any questions. And basically that's it. Thank you so much for having me. Bye!